This glass UI pop-up with a 3D cursor that clicks it and transitions into a clean Apple-style text reveal was built entirely in After Effects. And right now, every editor wants to learn how to create this kind of modern Apple-style animation. So I put together a full 35-minute masterclass to teach you guys how to create this exact scene step by step. By the end of this tutorial, you'll know how to design a dynamic animated background, build a sleek glass UI box with layered text, animate a 3D cursor click interaction, create that Apple-style text box reveal, and finally blend it all together with smooth transitions, motion design, and post-production polish. This is a value-packed masterclass, so if you want to follow along, I've linked all the project files and the assets down below for you guys. Now, if you're a video editor who wants to master creating high-quality animations like these, learn the viral editing styles of 2025, and actually make money with your video editing skills, then you need to be inside of Ultimate Editors. We've got 300 plus video editing masterclasses, 3 live coaching calls with me every single week, and new courses added monthly to keep you guys ahead of the game. The link to join Ultimate Editors is going to be down below. Alright, let's jump in and start building out this animation. Now, obviously, to get to work on our animation, the first thing we got to work on is the first scene. And one of the fundamental aspects of this first scene is this high quality background. So let's go ahead and get to work on making a high quality background. The first thing we're going to need is the blue part behind our circle. So to do this, we're going to right click and we're going to add in a new solid layer. Then we're just going to layer this with a 4-color gradient. Now, all I got to do is just place these points on the edges. Then we're just going to change one of them to this lightish blue, just like that, and make all of them the same color. Now, the key here is I'm only going to make color 4 a darker blue, color 3 a bit of a darker grayish blue, and color 1 and 2 a blue, and just increase the blend. I don't like the color in the bottom left, so I'm just going to go ahead and change this thing to a different kind of blue. Now that this is done, the big part of this background is obviously the big circle that's in the top. To make this, we just have to right click and add in a shape layer, and then we're just going to select our ellipse tool and hold down shift to draw out a huge circle. Now on this circle, we're going to click on fill and simply select the linear gradient. As a matter of fact, I'm actually going to use the radial gradient, which is just better for this kind of thing. Then by selecting my gradient fill, I'm going to see these 2 points here, and if I extend them, you guys can see I get the radial gradient. So let's go ahead and click on this color here. Let's click on our first color and make it black, and click on the second color and make it this really bright blue. What I would do is basically take the same color as the background, but just make it brighter. And we're going to bring that black a lot closer, all the way so that we can basically get a rough gradient. I'm going to click on P on the shape layer and just bring it up to the top over here until this thing takes up the upper half of the screen. And I'm also just going to scale it up and keep moving it to the top until it forms a sphere that takes up the top half of the screen. Let's go ahead and open the gradient fill inside of it. And let's just play around with this so that we just barely can see that blue edge, just like that. Now, how on earth do they create that very sharp, bright color on the edge? Well, it's very simple. We just have to add in a light sweep effect, and then we just need to set the center to somewhere like up over here and rotate it so that the tip is facing down here. So you notice how the edge has this kind of highlighted point over here? That's kind of what we want to make use of. Let's extend the width up until we have a nice long edge, and let's just increase the edge thickness and up the intensity up until we get a really sharp corner, just like that. Then we're just going to remove the sweep intensity and we're left with only the edge. And what I would even do just to get an even better effect is, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to duplicate the shape layer, so now we have 2 of them. And on my bottom shape layer, I'm just going to get rid of that light sweep. But on the top shape layer, I'm essentially going to leave the light sweep on. I'm going to click on the fill color, and I'm simply going to change it into a solid color. And I'm just going to make sure that my solid color is a black. Now the reason is, if I click on toggle switches and modes and set its blending mode to screen, now I have a layer which only has the light sweep, and you can clearly see that over here. Now why on earth would I need that? Well, if I essentially turn this color into a light blue like this, and then I add in the deep glow effect on it, then you can see how that creates the edge that I'm looking for. Now there's a few things to keep in mind. If we want to get this light edge, we need to make our background darker. So I'm going to take 0.1 in our background. I'm definitely going to make it darker. I'm also going to take 0.2 and make it just a darker gray. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my light sweep. I'm not going to go with a light blue. I'm going to go with a relatively darker blue, but just make it a lot harsher. So I'm going to increase the edge thickness, increase that intensity by a lot up until we get that really bright color, and maybe even bump up the width up until we have a nice even effect. That looks cool. We could tone down the edge thickness and increase the intensity to get an even harsher edge. And if you don't like how sharp it is, you can always layer on a Gaussian blur on top of all of these effects and simply increase the Gaussian blur up until you have a nice blurred out effect. I think this background looks very, very nice. The best thing we could do now is bring it to life. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe my current direction, click on U to see my keyframe, and I'm just going to move something like 6 seconds forward and just move it just a tiny bit. So this being said, the next step that we got to work on is obviously the big UI in the middle of the screen. And so how do we create that glass effect? Let me walk you guys through it step by step. The first thing we're going to need to create is that background glass. So to do this, we first need to set a placeholder, which is by adding in a shape layer and simply using our rectangle tool while holding down Shift to create the perfect square in the middle of the screen. Now, once you do this, you've got the placeholder for your UI. I'm just going to bring this up just a little bit, and that's going to be good. I'm basically just going to increase the roundness up until I have something round enough. And let me quickly just make sure my anchor point's at the center, because if I ever want to animate this, I have to make sure everything is sourced from the center. And just back again, as usual, I'm going to increase the roundness up until I have a clear UI. Now, I think this is round enough for a UI app icon, but I don't like the fact that it's too round, so I'm actually just going to tone it down a little bit. And I think 64 or 65 is going to be way more than enough. So now that we have our placeholder shape layer, we can essentially turn this into a white color just so that we can see it better. And we're going to right click and add in our adjustment layer. Now on our adjustment layer, the first thing we're going to get started with is adding in the Gaussian blur, and we're going to increase the amount up until it is very noticeable. Now we're going to track matte this to the shape layer, and guys, you can clearly see that it only gets applied to the shape layer. And that's basically how you create that cool effect. On top of the Gaussian blur, I'm also going to add in the brightness and contrast effect, and I'm simply going to increase the brightness and drop the contrast. And once again, this is also track matted to this icon shape layer, so you guys can clearly see it only affects this shape. I'll tone down the Gaussian blur just a little bit so that we can see a bit more. So one of the nicest effects to create on a glass icon is, first of all, having an inner glow and inner shadow sequence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the shape layer that is our placeholder. Since this is the shape which we're going to be relying on, we're going to duplicate it, and I'm going to drag it up to the top. Now when I drag it up to the top, I want to make sure that this layer is not track matted to this shape, and I'm going to make it visible so that I can see it. Now this one, I'm actually going to change its color to a black. So I'm going to go ahead and change the blending mode to screen. And one of the ways that you could stylize this is you can right click and add in the layer style called inner glow, and you'll just start by increasing the size up until you could see it. Then I'm going to change the color to obviously a bright white, maybe with a little bit of a bluish hue, something like this. And then we would just increase the range all the way up until it's barely noticeable, and simply tone down the opacity up until it looks realistic, which is something kind of like this. However, what looks even better than this is cornered light sweeps. Let's go ahead and select the inner glow and delete it, and we're going to go ahead and add in our light sweep effect. Let's set the center to the center of the shape layer and place this so that it hits the edge. We're going to increase the width and drop the sweep intensity, and we're simply going to increase the edge intensity just like so. And let's go ahead and tone down the edge intensity just so that we have a light edge, just like this. Now once we're happy with this edge, all we got to do is just duplicate this light sweep and put it on the other side, and we're going to be good to go. I'm also just going to tone down the width just a little bit just so that we have something that is a bit more realistic. I'm also going to add a deep glow to this, but I'm just going to make sure it is so incredibly light, like we're talking 0.1. One other effect that looks really good when combined with these layers is a drop shadow. Now how on earth are we going to add in a drop shadow without affecting the glass? All we have to do is actually just duplicate that shape layer once again. Let's go ahead and bring it up to the top so that we can see it this time. Let's make it visible. And instead of changing it to black, I'm just going to leave it as white for now. And I'm just going to go ahead and add in our drop shadow effect and increase that opacity, tone down the distance, and just increase the softness up until we can clearly see it. Once you can clearly see it, all you got to do is set the blending mode to darken. And I just have to put this under our shape layers and tone down the opacity until it's barely noticeable. Now, one more thing I do want to add, which is just a cool special effect that you guys can add on top of this. I like to add a little bit of a texture to the glass that is on there. The first thing we're going to do is right click and add in a solid layer. Then we're going to be adding in our fractal noise effect onto the solid layer. This is so that we can create a displacement map on here. Now for the displacement map type, I'm basically going to change the fractal type to smeary, and I'll play around with these settings based on the kind of effect that I want. But for now, let's go ahead and leave them together. Now to get the texture, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to add in an adjustment layer. And on this adjustment layer, I'm simply going to add in the Gaussian blur effect, bump it up to something like 50, and the brightness effect, and simply increase the brightness until it's relatively bright. Now all I have to do is track matte this to the white solid with my fractal noise, and once we click this is only going to be applied to the lighter values which we have on our fractal noise effect, and you can see the effect this does with the glow looks really cool. And so essentially what happens is if we increase the contrast and play around with the brightness, we can get a smeared look just like so. So by simply setting the fractal type to dynamic and simply increasing the contrast up until we get something like 75, and then decreasing the brightness and playing around with this up until we get the smear that we want. You can even play around with the complexity and decrease it if you want a blurrier smear, or increase it if you want a sharper one. And once we increase the brightness high enough, then we get this cool texture, which kind of looks like some fogged up glass. Then the final step is to essentially choose the layer on which everything is track matted, which is everything inside of the adjustment layer is being track matted to this white solid. And then we're just going to use our mask tool to simply draw out a mask that is going to be the exact size as our UI. And the way by which we achieve this is by fiddling around until we get the exact same size. Under the mask, we could just increase its expansion up until we have the same corner edge angle. And then we're just going to click on S and scale the mask down until it covers just our UI. I know it's a bit complex, but it just adds a lot to the edit, and I just had to get this done. So let's go ahead and just place them under all of these shape layers. This way, all of the effects are on top of them, but let's just make sure it is only on top of the Gaussian blur shape layer. And you guys can see this adds a very beautiful texture. The last thing we could do is obviously tone down the opacity if we don't want it to be too bright. Although we've just gotten started on our glass UI, we've covered some pretty advanced After Effects techniques. And I know some of you editors might feel a little behind on After Effects. That's why inside of Ultimate Editors, we've built a full A to Z After Effects masterclass combined with our animation recreation series to help you guys catch up fast. You'll learn everything there is to After Effects and how to use the program to create high quality animations like these. So if you're serious about mastering After Effects and creating these high quality animations, the link to join Ultimate Editors will be down below. Alright, with this done, we can finally work on adding the logo inside of this whole shape layer. So the logo that I'm personally going to be using is not going to be a logo, it's actually going to be text, just because it's easier to play around with and teach you guys how to use inside of After Effects. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and add in a new text layer and double click and write out the words U and E. I'm going to double click on these and make sure I'm using the heavy font and decrease the variation all the way up until they are essentially the same word. This is basically the Ultimate Editor's logo. Now I'm just going to go ahead and center the anchor point, click on S and increase its size up until it fills in our screen. Now once I've placed it at the center here, I want to use a special font. And so I ended up using the Helvetica Black Original, which just gives me this pretty thick font, and I just extended some variation between them. Alright, so now how do I make this stand out on my cool UI? Well, the first thing I should do is probably color it. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to Effects and Presets and add in the 4-color gradient. Now with the 4-color gradient, I'm just going to make sure that all of these edges are placed correctly. Now for this specific text, we're probably going to go with a light blue color. So for the first color, I'm basically just going to make it a very, very light blue. I'm going to make all of them the same color as well. For the second color, we're basically going to create this darker blue. For the third color, we're going to be using a more vibrant blue. And for the final color, we're simply going to be using a relatively darker blue. Just like this, by increasing the blend, we should get a pretty cool looking Ultimate Editors logo. The big thing here is if you want to really make this stand out, just go ahead and select one of these points, decrease the blend, and simply make all of them relatively close color, but just make one of these points really, really bright. The next step is we're going to add in some inner glow just to make this thing stand out a little bit. So we're going to right click, add into layer styles and click on inner glow. Then we're going to make it as bright as possible. We're going to change its color to a light blue color. We're going to increase its size up until we could see it, and then just simply increase the range up until it's less visible. Then we could just tone down the opacity up until it is way less visible. Now we're also going to set this apart with one more effect, which is the light sweep effect. And I'm just going to do this by adding in a light sweep effect and simply setting the center over here to the center. Now the main way I'm going to be using the light sweep effect is I'm going to basically drop the sweep intensity and just increase the width just so that we get this casted on edge. We can even decrease the edge thickness and just increase its intensity. As long as we just have that intense edge, we're going to be good to go, and just simply use a really light blue color. If you really want to take this a step further, we can even add in the drop shadow effect. Not that we're going to be creating a drop shadow, but instead we're simply just going to angle it so that it's at the exact opposite of the light sweep, increase its opacity all the way, and change its color to the light white. And this being said, the final effect, which you guys know and love, which we're going to be adding, is the deep glow. Because once we add this whole thing is going to come to life. And if we tone it down a little bit, we should be able to see it a bit better. Okay, so one quick thing I just wanted to do real quick, because I noticed this, is I want to get into the layer in which we made our fractal noise and the whole texture. And I just want to take the mask and I want to make it smaller by decreasing its mask expansion, but simply increasing its mask feather. And the reason for this is I just want it to be an effect that is kind of applied behind the Ultimate Editors, just as a subtle piece piece, not as something that takes up the whole UI. All right, now this being said, how do we go about animating this? The best way to do it is to basically parent all of them to one single layer and have it all be controlled by one singular layer. So to do this, I'm parenting the Ultimate Editor's text to the shape layer under it, the shape layer to the adjustment layer to the white solid to the adjustment layer, and then this one to the shape layer, and ultimately parenting this to the shape layer under it, which is where we're going to stop. And now if I move the position of this shape layer, the whole UI moves with it. So the main reason I want this is because I want to create an animation for this UI, and I just want it to kind of pop in, and then we could go from there. And since we're going with this whole Apple style, we're going to need to really play around with the keyframes. And I'm going to keyframe its current position, which is going to be its end position, and end it at around 2 seconds. I'm obviously going to start it off the screen at the bottom here, but somewhere around the middle over here, I'm just going to have it overshoot and then shoot back down. Now let's go ahead and play around with these keyframes to make it look really, really good. We're going to select these, bring them into our graph, right click and use our value graph. First thing we're going to do is go ahead and separate these dimensions so that we can only work on our Y position. Then we're going to select all of it and F9 so that we could start working on it. Now once we take a look at this, I just want it to start really, really fast, and I want it to kind of shoot up over to here, and then I want it to kind of transition slowly back into the down at the bottom. So we're going to put this peak up over here just like so. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring both these keyframes back like so, and bring this one especially back, and put this one somewhere around here in the middle. We're also just going to make sure that it starts quicker. So we're going to start off here, we're going to have it pause up at the peak and then flow back down. So now what's happening is the start is quick, but the end is slow. So we're going to end this like so. All right, cool. Now we have a bit of an issue. The timing is still a bit off. So I'm going to bring these even closer and just make sure that this first one over here is a bit rougher as well. Something like that should be better. First up, let's click on R and keyframe its current rotation, then click on U so that we can see all of our keyframes. Our current rotation is 0 degrees, which is what I want it to end at. I'm going to have it start at something like -4, and then I'm going to have it go up to something like 4, and then eventually come back down to 0. Once again, let's bring this into our value graph. Let's select all of these and just make sure that we click on F9. We're going to start this movement quick, have a slow change up top, and then end very, very slowly. We also do want to make sure that by this point, this whole animation is done with rotating. All right, that looks a lot better. And one final thing we can also do is play around with the scale just to make sure we get a cool effect. So we're going to start it off at a scale of 90. Then we're going to go up to here, which is where the scale is going to get up to 110. And then we're going to go to the final one and bring it back down to 100. I think 110 is definitely too intense. We might bring it up just to 104. Let's go ahead and bring our scale property in. Select all of these and click on F9, and we're just going to make sure that we smoothen this out just as we've done with every other animation. Now this whole scale animation I'm not the biggest fan of, just because it kind of looks too cartoony, so I'm just going to make sure it's very minor and barely noticeable. With this done, we can move into the next section. In the next section, we're essentially going to have a 3D cursor flow into the screen in a 3D movement, and then click on this button, and then we're going to transition into our next UI scene. Now before we dive into the 3D cursor animation, which is where everything comes together, I want to show you guys something we've been building out for editors like you for over a year. I've noticed that most editors like you want to be able to do 3 things. They want to be experts in Premiere Pro and After Effects, they want to learn all the viral editing styles of 2025, and they also want to be able to land editing clients and make $1,000 per month with video editing. And so we decided we're going to teach you how to do all of that in less than 90 days. This is Ultimate Editors. First, we teach you Premiere Pro and After Effects, front to back, so you actually master the software. Then we dive deep into the viral editing styles of 2025. Josh Leon, Iman Gaji, Devin Jatho, and even my style. So you're building animations that are in demand right now. From there, we give you our client acquisition plan, showing you exactly how to land your first clients, build your brand, and turn editing into a full-time income. And every single month, we drop new high-level masterclasses. Last month, we added in our Blender Masterclass for video editors, and this month, we're looking to revamp our Iman Gaji editing masterclass. On top of that, I host 3 live coaching calls every single week to work with you guys on a personal level. And our editors are already landing clients and making $1,000 every single month in less than 3 months of joining Ultimate Editors. And chances are, if you're enjoying this tutorial, you're gonna love having access to 300 more video editing masterclasses just like this one. Go ahead and click the link down below to join Ultimate Editors. Let's make you guys experts at Premiere Pro and After Effects, teach you the viral editing styles of 2025, and get you your first $1,000 per month editing job. The link is going to be down below. But with all this being said, let's get back to making that 3D cursor animation. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to add in a shape layer. Now this shape layer, I'm essentially going to use my pen tool to draw out a triangle. I'll try and get this down as perfect as possible. So we're going to add in these 3 shapes over here. And the whole trick is I just want to use my pen tool to add one more shape in the middle here. And I just simply need to move it up to the top like so. And now we have a cursor. Finally, to round it off, we're going going to click on the add button over here. We're going to add in the round corners function, and then we're just going to increase its radius to something like 20, which should give us relatively rounded corners. Now, I want to go way more rounded, so I think we're going to go up to something like 40. I think we could do even better. Let's go up to 60. There we go. I think that looks absolutely awesome. Now, how are we going to actually turn this into a 3D cursor? We're going to select it. We're actually going to set the fill color to something like a lightish blue. I want to actually use a darker blue, mainly because I'm going to use lightish blue on the edges. So let's go ahead and use a darker blue color here. We can always change this if it doesn't look good. Then I'm simply going to go into my stroke over here and just go ahead and increase the stroke width a little bit up until we can kind of see it. And then I'm just going to set it to a bright white. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make the stroke width super thin. Maybe a 3 is going to be good. Finally, we're going to go ahead and take our shape layer, right click and pre-compose it on its own. Inside of my shape layer pre-composition, I can go ahead and click on toggle switches and modes and set this into a 3D layer. Now, if I wanted to add some geometry in this, or if I wanted to make it an actual physical 3D layer, here's what I'm going to do. First up, to view a 3D layer, I need to use my second view over here. Make sure I'm using custom view 1. Then we're going to set this into advanced 3D, which is where it's going to get a bit complex. Then we're going to go ahead and open this thing up, go into geometry options and increase the extrusion depth until we have a thickness. But one thing I am going to do is I'm going to keep its extrusion relatively lower. Let's go ahead and make that fill color a bit more blue, just so that we can end up with a more bluish cursor. And we go inside, there's obviously a difference. It's that inside of our pre-composition, we have our 3D layer, which allows us to click on R and rotate it in a 3D dimension like so. So let's go ahead and create our animation. First, let's go ahead and scale it down so that it is a lot smaller. But before we do anything, one big trick you always need to keep in mind before working with 3D objects, and this is a mistake that a lot of beginners do, is make sure you use the view that's on the left side and take a look at your anchor point. Your anchor point's on the face, whereas it should be at the center. So move the Z axis of your anchor point until it's at the center of your object, and it's going to look a lot better. Let's start by moving it from the left side. We're going to go ahead and scale it down to around half of its original size. We're going to click on P, keyframe its current position. Let's extend both of these so that we can see both of our layers. We're going to go ahead and end it at 2 seconds on this mark over here, but we're going to start it off all the way off to the left. So now we can select both of these. We're going to right click and make sure we're using the speed graph for this. Make sure it starts fast and then ends slow. Now this happens way too fast, so let's go ahead and slow it down a bit more. Now as it comes to the pause, we're here at 3 seconds. We're going to end up doing the click, but I also wanted to start with some kind of rotation. We could see it over here. Let's click on R, keyframe our X, Y, and Z rotation. Click on U. We're going to just start off with the cursor being flat, just like this, and having a little bit of an orientation. And as it comes in, what's essentially going to happen is I want it to rotate once. I want it to rotate like this. I want it to rotate also upward, and I also want it to rotate just like so. And what this is going to do is it's going to come in and make it rotate like so. Let's go ahead and select all of these and just make sure that they all also start fast and end slow. And so if we watch this in real time, what's essentially happening is it's flying in just like this, which looks cool, but it does hide our logo. So I'm going to go over to here. I'm just going to make sure that the second position here is a bit lower. So I do still think it is too big. So let's go ahead and definitely scale this thing down to like 35. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my last position, move it over to the right side a bit more, and just orient these so that we can see a bit more of the actual cursor. Once it comes into this point right over here, we're going to create our click. Now to do the click, there's a few ways to go about it, and I'm essentially just going to move around half a second forward, and I'm going to make it just kind of kick up like this on the Y value, and half a second forward and have it kick back down like this on the Y value. And if I select this and play around with the speed graph and make sure that it starts slow and ends slow, this is going to be a tricky graph to play with. However, if I could get this right, this is going to give me an amazing animation. Now, obviously this thing happens too fast, so I'm actually going to slow it down a bit more and slow down those edges. And this way it is starting to look a lot better. And once the click happens, then I'm going to have it go off the screen. And so to do this, I'm essentially going to use this over here by keyframing its position and orientation. And I'm simply just going to have it fly off the screen to the top like this. And as it's going up, I'm going to have it do a full rotation on the Y value and another one on the X. That's going to go just like this. So let's go ahead and get started with the position keyframes. We're going to make sure that it starts slow, but relatively faster. And then we're just going to make sure that it ends fast. As for the rotation keyframes, we're simply just going to make sure that they start slow and also end slow, meaning the peak is going to be somewhere in the middle, which is where it is visible for the viewer. Now, once this happens on our screen, this thing flows in, clicks, and then goes all the way up. We can obviously add some post-production to this by adding in a deep glow onto this cursor, just to obviously create the full effect. Now, once this click happens, I'm then going to have the UI behind it actually actually react with this, this is where it gets interesting. So right around here, I need this UI to react with it. And for this reason, I'm going to go down to the shape layer, which controls it, where before this cursor even appears onto the UI, we're going to have it scale up just a tiny little bit, something like 110. It's just so that when that cursor comes in, it's almost like this thing is reacting with it. And as soon as the click happens, what essentially is going to happen is we're going to start our scale keyframe right here, move a few frames until the click occurs, and then we're simply going to scale this thing back down to 95 and a few frames forward and scale it back up to 100. Now we're obviously going to play around with this so that it starts very slow and it has to peak and then overshoot just a little bit like so. Now, after this click happens, it's cool, it's interactive, but I feel like there's more that we could do. What I mean by this is I'm going to be adding in another shape layer here, and I'm going to be using the ellipse tool to draw out a perfect circle, the exact shape of the square. For this circle, I'm going to be removing its fill, and I'm simply going to be adding a regular stroke that is relatively thin. So I'm going to keyframe the scale starting at 0, then I'm going to move forward till after the click, and I'm just going to increase the scale up to around here. Now let's just make sure that this thing starts fast and then slows down. All of this stuff is going to occur, and I'm just going to make sure that the circle starts right at the peak of the click. Now what we're going to do with the circle is we're going to add in a deep glow like this. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm also going to track matte it to the same shape layer as the entire UI icon, which means it's only going to appear inside of our UI icon. This would look even better if it was placed under our Ultimate Editor's logo. Now this looks great, but it is still a bit harsh, so I'm also going to be adding in the CC Radial Fast Blur effect, and I'm also keeping the amount relatively low so that we can clearly see that circle. And now to transition into our next UI scene, right after this click happens, we're going to begin the movement to the top of the screen. The first thing we're going to start with is our background, where we're going to first have this whole circle move up to the top. Now don't forget this circle also has this whole light sweep effect on it. So I'm actually going to parent this light sweep to the circle here, click on P for the circle, keyframe its position, and then we're just going to move forward up until this whole animation is done and simply have the circle move off to the top of the screen. Once it's at the top, we're going to go ahead and cut it and delete it. Now inside of our speed graph, just make sure this thing starts super slow and ends very fast. So the circle starts first, and then it's time for this UI animation over here, which is where we're basically going to create the second cartoon animation where it pops down and then goes back up. So we're going to keyframe the current Y position and then just move to the end and have it slide off to the top. And we're obviously going to take these keyframes into our speed graph and just make sure we're using the value graph for this one. Then we're just going to go ahead and move forward to around here, add another keyframe, and this keyframe is going to be kind of like up here. So we're going to have it like bump up somewhere around here, and then we're going to have it just bounce all the way back down. And while all this is happening, we can also play around with the rotation. We could just keyframe the current rotation, move forward, and then just play around with it, give it a little bit of a rotation and end it at a different rotation. Also just make sure that this thing starts slow and then peaks right around here and then ends fast. And with both of these off of the screen, that's pretty much everything for this animation. We could select all of these, click on Ctrl+Shift+D and cut them out. Now this essentially means this whole pop-up happens, the cursor comes in, the click occurs, and then this whole thing moves off the screen. Alright, the first scene is done and you've already created something that looks incredible. Now imagine doing this every single week but at 5 times this level. That's exactly what our students are learning at Ultimate Editors. We teach you how to create animations like these and create viral edits, whether it's short form or long form. Once again, the link to join Ultimate Editors is going to be down below. Now, once everything moves off the screen, it's time to transition into our next scene, and our next scene is going to need a way darker background. So to do this, we're going to select our background, and we're simply going to go back to this point here and keyframe the current colors as they are. Then we're going to move forward a little bit, like right around here, and we're simply going to change these colors. I'm just going to make the top a very dark blue. This side is going to be a very, very dark gray. This side is definitely going to turn into a very, very darkish gray, and the side on the right is also going to turn into a very dark blue. And this way, ladies and gentlemen, we can transition from one scene into the other. And this being said, as we transition into a different color, this is now the beginning of our second animation. So first up, let's go ahead and get to work on the placeholders for the UI messages. So to do this, we're going to right click and start by adding in a shape layer. And for this shape layer, I'm going to be selecting my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and draw out a nice and simple rectangle. The first thing I'm doing is basically removing my stroke, and I'm also just going to be adding in a little bit of roundness, just a tiny bit. Next up, let's go ahead and color this with the 4-color gradient as usual, but let's go ahead and bring these points a lot closer, obviously. Then let's go ahead and set one of these colors to something like a really dark gray. Let's go ahead and make all of them that same exact color. Then we're simply going to make one of these bottom colors slightly lighter, and another one slightly lighter, and one of these top colors slightly darker. And by bumping up that blending mode, you guys can expect to see a very high quality placeholder. The thing that's going to make this placeholder very special is that I'm actually going to be duplicating it, and using its position, I'm going to move it slightly up. This is going to expose a bit of an extra lip over here at the bottom. Now, if I take this color gradient, and I essentially change all these colors into bright colors. So one's going to be a bright blue, one can be a bright pink, one can be a bright orange, and one can be like a bright green. And so this is how you get this very, very cool effect. We're going to place point 1 on the left side here, point 2 right next to it, point 3 and point 4 on the edges over here. And when we do this, you basically get this kind of RGB looking strip at the bottom of your UI. The main ways that we're going to be bringing this thing to life is we're actually going to be randomizing it by simply keyframing the position of all of our points. We're going to be placing these keyframes all the way at the beginning. We're going to move something like 1 second in, and we're simply just going to move them along the line like so. Then we're going to move 1 second in. We're going to move them along the line like so. Then we're going to move 1 second in, move them once again, whoops, along the line like so. And all that I'm doing is just randomizing their points in accordance to their timing. And once again, guys, move them along the line like so. So what you end up with is this randomization of these colors just like this. And just like that, you can pretty much copy this and paste it one more time, and then paste it one more time again. And when you do this, you basically get a complete randomization of these 4 colors. Now, if you do this, you can also change the actual colors you're using. So in my opinion, green isn't really a good one. Red is just a much better one that we could use. And that just looks absolutely amazing, doesn't it? We could go ahead and add in one final piece of details, which is actually going to be an inner glow. This just adds a bit more detail. I'm going to right click and click on inner styles and click on inner glow. We're going to go down to inner glow, increase its opacity, increase the size up until we could see it, and increase the range all the way. Now here's the thing with inner glows. Let's just make sure this one is a cool one, and just to make sure that we increase the size enough to be noticeable and decrease the opacity until it's barely visible. Now this being said, now that we have the shape layer and the background for it, we need to go to the next step, which is going to be the text. The main way that we're going to do this is we're going to right click and we're going to add in a new text layer. On this text layer, I'm going to write out my main text, which is going to be best community. Now I'm going to be using the SF UI display font because that's usually the best one to use for UI animations. And I'm simply going to be using the biggest one essentially. Now the next step is we're just going to go ahead and align it over here where it's supposed to be, and we're just going to go ahead and scale this thing up until it's big and takes up the whole entire thing. Once it is like this, you guys can see it already looks really, really nice. The main thing I'm going to be adding in is a gradient ramp, placing the top point right on top of the text and the bottom point right at the bottom of the text. We're going to be swapping colors and making sure that the bottom color is just a dark gray. Something like this will work. And then on top of this, to really, really highlight this effect, we're going to right click and we're going to click on layer styles and add an inner glow to our text. This inner glow is going to be a very cool white, and we're going to increase its opacity so that we can see it, bump up the size just a little bit, and you guys can already see this makes a huge difference. We're just going to increase the range up until it is less noticeable. Now we want to go ahead and move on to our next text, so we're going to go ahead and duplicate the word best community, and I'm just going to go ahead and click P and move it down so that you guys can see it down here. What I'm essentially going to do is move these same 2 points for the gradients down here. Instead, this time we're going to choose the top color as a dark black and the bottom color as a dark gray. Let's go ahead and delete that inner glow because we're no longer going to need it. And let's go ahead and swap these colors. Now, I think this is way too dark. What I essentially want to do is kind of a similar white, but just way lighter. So let's go ahead and go with a lighter gray over here, something like the middle. And let's go ahead, go with a darker black at the end over here. And I'm obviously going to be using the regular or thin font. And now I'm going to write out a quick description for the best community. Ultimate editors. Now this being said, obviously this is too big, so let's go ahead and scale it down up until it doesn't take up too much space, and let's go ahead and align it right under the words best community, and let's go ahead and align both of these proportionally in the middle of our UI. And with this done, we can pretty much finalize this by adding in the deep glow effect onto the back layer over here, which is really going to stand out up until we decrease that exposure so that it's barely noticeable. And then also to only make the deep glow visible on the bottom lip instead of around the whole thing, we're just going to go ahead and select both of these bottom layers here for the UI. We're going to right click and click on pre-compose. This is going to make them their own pre-composition, which is totally fine with us. And we're just going to go ahead and add in a deep glow on this and essentially just tone down the exposure to something like 0.2. And obviously I don't want the deep glow to be applied to the gray layer up top. And so for this reason, I'm going to go down to input and increase the threshold up until it doesn't apply to anything except the colors at the bottom. And this being said, we end up with this. Real quick guys, we're going to start animating text inside of After Effects using our After Effects text animator tool. And trust me, this tool is where great text animations are made. But it's also one of the most overlooked and misunderstood tools of After Effects. Inside of Ultimate Editors, we break down this tool in full. How to use it, how to master it, and how to create 10 out of 10 text animations using the text animator tool. I just want to let you guys know about this in the case that you find this animator tool a bit confusing or perhaps overwhelming. The link to joining Ultimate Editors is still going to be down below in the description. Very high quality UI animation. So to make the text flow in, let's go ahead and select the words best community. And let's go ahead and open this thing up and click on the animate tool. Let's go ahead and add in a position factor, and we're simply going to have this thing pop in from the top. Let's go down to our range selector, keyframe our start, move around 2 seconds in, and simply increase it all the way. Now let's go down to advanced. Let's set the units to index. Then let's go down to shape, set this thing to ramp up. And this is where it's going to get pretty interesting. So it's going to go ahead and animate itself down, but I'm not sure if it's going to go all the way. Let's go to the beginning and decrease the end all the way so that we can see the full animation. Then let's go to the end and increase the start up until we have a value where the animation is complete. We want to make sure it starts slow and then speeds up so that we can counter it. So we're going to go ahead and start this slow and then speed it up. Now with this being said, we also don't want to stop there. We do want to add a few more factors. The first one that we're going to be adding in is under property. We're going to be adding in the opacity property and starting it off at 0%. We also want the words Ultimate Editors Community to also animate in, and instead of recreating this whole thing from scratch, I'm just going to right click and I'm just going to go ahead and select Animator 1 and copy it. And then I'm going to move over to here and simply click Ctrl V to duplicate this. The only difference is I'm going to delay the words Ultimate Editors, and then I'm actually going to go in here and I'm going to change a few things. The first thing I'm going to do is actually change its position so that it starts under instead of above. And the next thing I'm going to do is actually change the start value so that it ends at a straight line. And with this done, this completes the whole animation. The final part is going to be animating this UI screen coming in. And to do this, we are just going to be parenting the Ultimate Editors community to the best community and the best community to the pre-comp, and then simply scaling this thing down and moving it to the right side over here. And we're simply going to have it pop in over here on the right side. And so to do this, we're going to end its position keyframe over here. We're going to move back and we're just going to make sure that we start this position keyframe all the way back here. We're going to select both of these, go into our graph, right click and make sure we're using our value graph. Let's go ahead and separate these dimensions so that we can create our animation. Let's select both of these, click on F9 to smooth it out, start it slow and then speed it fast, and then just make sure it overshoots a little bit. Now I do want it to overshoot right around this point, so for this reason I'm also going to add in a keyframe for the X position, and I'm also just going to make sure that this thing really overshoots just a tiny bit and then comes back down. Now all I want to do is basically take all 3 of these and Ctrl D to duplicate all 3 layers, move them up to the top and delay them a little bit more. This is going to act as our second set, and for our second set what we're essentially going to do is click on U and just delete all of these position keyframes, because I'm going to be moving this specific layer all the way down to the bottom. So let's go ahead and move its Y position down and move its X position down to the left side. Now with this done, I am also going to go in here and just change a few of the colors we're using. We're just going to go with a blue theme for this one, so we're using blue color here. Let's just go with a bright blue here. Let's go with a slightly purplish color here, and let's go with a really bright cyan blue here. And this should give us a pretty cool effect as well. Awesome. Now keep in mind, if you change this, it's going to affect both pre-compositions. So instead, to fix this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything that's inside of this, go outside and then paste it outside of my pre-composition. This is essentially going to allow me to redo the same animation once more. So this time, let's go ahead and change these colors to what we want them to be. And now let's go ahead and right click and pre-compose it and add our deep glow to it using the same exact exposure, and going down to input and increasing our threshold so that it only affects the blue colors at the bottom. And then finally there's our text over here that we're just going to select, click on P and align it to the right side at the top. And this time we're going to align this piece of text to the right side here. So this being said, now we can parent this to the pre-composition, take that pre-composition and then align it with the bottom left of our screen. For the word best community, instead of using a white and grayish style, we're going to be deleting that gradient ramp and adding in a 4 color gradient to our text. Now we're going to be placing our points all throughout this text, so one over here. And although I do like the inner glow, I don't think it is set up properly, so I'm just going to go ahead and open it, go down to my layer styles, inner glow, and instead of sending the blending mode to screen, we're going to set it to soft light. Now we're simply going to start by using this lightish kind of purple color. The second color we're going to use is this bright kind of pink. Third color we're going to use is perhaps maybe a bluish color. And lastly, we're going to use a really whitish pink. Okay, so most of these colors are pretty light, so we're going to need one that's actually like a pretty bright pink. Now we're just going to need the rest of them to be relatively lighter colors. And I'm also going to be adding in a deep glow to this text and setting the exposure all the way down to 0.1. And for this word, I'm going to be using the words video editing. Then I'm simply going to be scaling it up just a little bit more, moving its position to the right so that it's aligned with my UI box. And for the bottom words, I'm also going to be moving its position so that it's aligned with the top text. Instead of using a gray, I'm simply going to be using a lighter white color and typing out a full description. And to finalize this, we're also going to add in the same pop-up animation as the one up top. We're simply going to click on P, move around 2 seconds in, add a keyframe for the position, go ahead and move it to where our end of the animation happens. Let's move over to the beginning and make sure we start it off to the left side. Let's select both of these, go into our animation. Let's go and separate these dimensions and select our X position. Let's go over to the point where we are almost done with the animation, which is right over here. We're going to add in another keyframe, and I'm simply going to move this up so that it overshoots just a little bit. Now, ultimately, we're going to select all of these, click on F9 to smooth them. Let's make sure it starts fast and then pops up and then smoothly transitions back down. Now, this being said, I am going to start this way later after all of this has happened. I'm going to start this thing around 1 second late. So this thing's going to come in and then this thing is going to come in at the bottom. And I am also just going to make sure that I've toggled the motion blur for all of these different layers because that is pretty crucial in these kinds of animations. And now the final part of both of these is I just want to have some text pop in the center over here. And so we're going to right click and we're going to add in a text layer. And we're simply going to write out a pretty long paragraph. Once I've typed out a pretty long paragraph, I'm going to select all of these and I'm actually going to decrease the distance in between the lines, and I'm also going to decrease the size of my font. This being said, I want it to be big enough to be readable, and I'm not going to be using the heavy font. I'm just going to be using the medium font. Let's go ahead and make sure the lines are all over here, and we're also just going to make sure that we center their origin. Once they have all been well placed and they are all nicely aligned, I'm going to make sure that they are at the center of the screen. I'm going to go ahead and make this actually a 2-liner just because I think it's going to look a lot better here. Let's go ahead and copy the same gradient ramp that we have applied on the word best community up here because I think this one looks really good. Let's just go ahead and reset the start and end values. The next thing we're also going to want to do is copy the same exact inner glow, and we're going to just go ahead and paste it on this specific layer. Now, this being said, we are going to need to play around with this because we do have way smaller words. So let's just make sure that the size is properly aligned. And finally, I'm also going to be adding in a cool animation to this entire line. While this whole thing is popping in, I'm going to go ahead and click down here and click on animate and click on position. We're simply going to start all of this stuff down here, and we're going to click on our range selector, keyframe the start back here. Then we're simply going to move over for a few seconds and then just end the start value over here. Now, this is just going to robotically go through all of our text, which is not something we want. Instead, we want it to go through word by word. So to do this, we go down to advanced. Instead of it being based on characters, let's base it off of words. That's going to be way better. Now for the shape, let's go ahead and use ramp up. And now we're also going to add in another property, and this one's going to be the opacity property. We're also just going to make sure that we start them at 0% and have them pop in with time. And finally, we're going to add in one final property, which is going to be the blur property. And we are simply going to start them with pretty heavy blur. Now, this being said, this whole animation is still robotic. And this is mainly just because of the shape we're using. You could use a smooth shape if you want. Once we change our units into index, this is going to make a lot more sense. Let's go back all the way and set the end to 0, making sure the start starts at 0%. We're going to go all the way to the end and increase the start value up until all of it is clear and crystal. And obviously it's going to be fast by nature, so we're going to just make sure that we slow down the start and speed up that end. And all I'm going to do is simply, after this whole animation happens, I'm just going to overlap this text over to here so that this whole thing happens all together. And right around the 10-second mark, I'm simply just going to cut all of this stuff because this whole animation is done. Now that all of our animation is complete, it's finally time to dive into post-production. And you guys already know this is where we take an animation from an 8 out of 10 into a 10 out of 10. So the first big thing I want to start by adding is right-clicking and adding in an adjustment layer. So let's go ahead and start by adding in this noise effect over here. And I'm simply going to set the percentage to something like 5%. Then I'm simply duplicating this adjustment layer, but this time deleting the noise effect and adding in our CC vignette effect. Obviously, you guys know this is a subtle but effective effect, especially when added in high amounts, like 150 or 190. You can pretty much notice it quickly. And so I am going to tone down the angle of view to 25 so we can see more of it. Another thing that we could also add is obviously the cinematic bars, which we all know and love. So we're going to right click and add in a solid layer, just make sure it's black. Then we're going to use our rectangle tool to essentially come over here. And let's draw out a simple rectangle just like so. And then we're just going to go ahead and invert it. And that's pretty much it for this animation, guys. Thanks a lot for watching. And if you've enjoyed learning an animation like this one, you're going to absolutely love the 300+ video editing masterclasses that I've created specifically for editors like you guys inside of Ultimate Editors. Whether you're someone who wants to pick up video editing completely from scratch or master creating animations like these, I'm going to be teaching you absolutely everything inside of Ultimate Editors. So this being said, guys, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this kind of animation, I've gone ahead and made 2 other free videos, free tutorials for you guys to enjoy. I'm gonna go ahead and leave them up here. Thank you so much for watching all the way till the end. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this format of the video. If you don't, also please let me know. God bless all of you guys, and I'll see you in the next animation that we make. Goodbye, guys.